Welcome to Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk. This program is an outpouring of the ministry going on at Calvary Chapel, Chambersburg in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Here's what's coming up in today's message.
You ever felt like, God calls you and then you're like, yeah, but I'm just or yeah, but I'm not ready, or yeah, Moses did that, right? Moses is called, remember that? And Moses is like, yeah, but I'm not a good speaker. Who made your mouth, Moses? I can deal with this, God says, the next time God initiates a work and you begin by saying, yeah, God, but I'm just but God, I'm not very good at it. Yeah, but God, I don't even know my social security number. Whatever, yeah, but God, I don't swear. Yeah, but I got this excuse, God. God says, I don't care who you are. Do you believe me that this is what I want to do? If you do, follow me.
When God called Moses to lead the Israelites, he began to make excuses about his poor speaking ability. Despite his shortcomings, God used him to guide the Israelites out of Egypt. Similarly, God has plans for your life. However, you may create excuses for your flaws and attempt to shift the responsibility to others. In today's message, Pastor Dan discusses how God strengthens you. When he calls you for his purpose, you can be confident that he will turn your weaknesses into your strengths. Now here's Pastor Dan in the book of Ezra chapter 2, as he continues his message, The Restorative Plan of God.
Would you say to yourself, let me start in the top left corner and I'm just going to read this thing all across and all down until I get to the bottom right corner? You wouldn't do that because it's not meant to be read that way. It's meant to be understood and then utilized when needed. And that's exactly what this list is here as well. This list is here for a reason. It's to give a reward to the faithful that returned. These people are sitting up in heaven right now saying, wow, thank you, Lord. You put my name in the book. And the Lord looks right back at them and he says, no, listen. I delight in the faithful. You are faithful. And so therefore, I rewarded you with this eternal reward. We're going to read just a couple of the verses here in chapter 2. Let's just start off at the top, chapter 2, verse 1. Now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, every one unto his city, which came with Zerubbabel. That's going to be our main guy, okay? He's going to be the governor back in the land of Israel, Zerubbabel. And then it mentions Joshua. Joshua is the high priest. Joshua's grandfather was the high priest at the time that Nebuchadnezzar came in and executed him. So Joshua is in the lineage of the high priest, and he will be going back to the land, and he will become the high priest. And then the next name listed is Nehemiah. I don't want you to be confused by that. That is not the Nehemiah that we're going to see 100 years later in the book of Nehemiah. This is a different one. But it begins to list the names here at the end of verse 2, the number of the men of the people of Israel. And then starting in verse 3, it lists them all by family. The children of Parash, there was 2,172. In verse 4, the children of that guy was 372. And it just continues down, making the case of all of these individual family names that are named. It doesn't even just say, of the tribe of Judah, there was 30,000, and of the tribe of Benjamin, there was 8,000, and of the tribe of Manasseh, there was 4,000. No, it goes right down to the family name. Of the tribe of Wilson, there was 3,000. Of the tribe of Powers, there was, 2,000 that went. Of the tribe of Richardson, of the tribe of the sons of Richard, or whatever, Okay, that was English. You get the idea. This is their names. This is the very families that went back, that are being recognized and rewarded. These are Israelites, and then even the towns that they were from and that they went back to, all of the faithful people. This Zerubbabel, by the way, one of the things that's interesting about this Zerubbabel, he is in the lineage and the line of King David. One of the things that's so interesting, though, about this, and I don't want to get too distracted at this point, but remember that King David's son, they were on the throne, right? Solomon, Rehoboam, right down through. We got down to Hezekiah and Josiah. They're on the throne of David, right? Before the captivity. Do you remember when we got to the one grandson of Josiah named Jeconiah? He was also named Jehoiachin. And God cursed him and said there was not going to be anybody of his lineage sitting on my throne. And there wasn't just before the captivity. Well, this Zerubbabel is a descendant of that Jeconiah. So this Zerubbabel is going to end up going back to be governor in the land of Israel. But remember, because of that curse, the curse on Jeconiah is that nobody in your lineage, including Zerubbabel, can end up being an independent ruler in Israel. So the whole time Zerubbabel leads, as he goes back, he's just going to be a governor under the Medo-Persian Empire. There will never be another king over Judah that will rule as an independent rule until Jesus comes. Jesus has come, and when he comes back at his second coming, he will take the literal throne of David for 1,000 years on this earth. And that is the one that we're waiting for. So this Zerubbabel will have a governorship, but not a kingship. But the Messiah, Jesus, he will come and he will reign on the throne of David. I just encourage you for homework, go look at Acts chapter 15 for how the Jerusalem Council talks about how they understand that the church age has to happen first, and then the Messiah will come and sit on the throne of David. Very interesting stuff from Acts 15. So we have all of these family names. Just look at these verses. I would rather not butcher their names. There's nothing unique as far as language we have to read until you get down to verse. So this original listing of names, let me tell you that it ends in verse 35. I want to look at verse 36, because from verse 36 to verse 39, it mentions not just these families, but now it mentions the priests. In verse 36, it says, the priests of the children of Jediah, of the house of Joshua, 973, and then there's other priests listed here in verses 37, 38, and 39. So there was 4,289 priests altogether that returned, led by the high priest Joshua, and he will be important in this book and also in Haggai and Zechariah, of course. But one of the things I find interesting, though, is that Zerubbabel the governor that's going back on this first wave, and Joshua the high priest, the politician and the clergy, they're inseparable. You look at these two guys throughout the next 5 chapters, they're inseparable. The spiritual goal of Joshua the high priest is the exact same goal as Zerubbabel the governor. Zerubbabel's goals as governor are the exact same as the spiritual man Joshua. They're lock sync. Oh man, would you long for that in America? To have your politicians wanting the same thing as what the church wants? These two guys will be inseparable, doing the will of God faithfully. Now in verse 40 through 42, we have the other Levites that are listed. These are the others of the tribe of Levi that were not the priests. And then we get to verse 43, and there's an interesting group of people here. From verse 43 down to verse 54, who are these? It begins in verse 43, and it calls them, in verse 43, the Nethinim, the children of, and then they start naming them. All of these names from verse 43 to 54 are the Nephilim. Well, who are the Nephilim? Well, they're not of one of the tribes. Remember, we have been reading these names by what? By family, right? Not even by tribe, by more specific than tribe. We've been reading them by families. And now we get to this group called the Nephilim. There's a group of families called the Nephilim. Well, what's that? Well, the word Nephilim means temple servants. It's the temple servants. In Joshua chapter 9, we read in Joshua chapter 9, as they came into the land to conquer the land, that when in Joshua chapter 9, as they first came into the land under Joshua, do you remember the story in Joshua chapter 9 when there was a group of people that came up to the Israelites when they first got into the land, And all the Canaanites were scared because Israel's conquering, right? Jericho has just fallen. All the pagan nations are scared. And what happens? The Gibeonites, they're like, man, Joshua's going to wipe us all out. So they devised this plan to put on old clothes, to get the moldy food, and to act like they just traveled from really far away, meaning a place that Joshua didn't have to destroy. They acted like they were from really far away, and they said, hey, we want to be your friends. We want to have a pact with you. And Joshua didn't ask the Lord about these Gibeonites, and he did. He went into an agreement with them, a pact, an alliance. And then God said, Joshua, you were foolish. You shouldn't have done that. They are people that were from the land. They were Canaanites from the land that my judgment was on for you to execute them. And now you can't because you made a pact with them. So these called here the Nephilim are the Gibeonites, the descendants of the Gibeonites. They don't call them Gibeonites because they no longer have the identity as being that foreign nation of Gibeon. They are now known as the Nephilim. The Gibeonites, that identity is gone. All of these people, they're not Israelites, they're not Jews, but generation after generation has passed, and these people now identify with Israel. They're now proselytes. They're now people that believe in the ways of Israel, and they are there to serve as temple servants. That is their job. So the descendants of the Gibeonites became loyal to Israel. And even here, you see that they were loyal to Zerubbabel. Think about this, guys. These people, their ancestors tricked Israel to not die. Their ancestors became loyal to Israel. But now they got kicked out into Babylon with all these Israelites. They're free. You see that, right? They're free. They don't have to go back to Israel. They're not Jews. And yet they say, no, we believe in this cause. We believe in this God, and we're going to go back and we're going to help them restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Wow. In a lot of ways, guys, that's the picture of you and me. We're Gentiles, right? We're not God's natural born Israel. We're the engrafted in believers. And we're the ones that say, no, we've come to believe in you. And we're not leaving. We're not going anywhere. We're staying right here. Even the Gentiles of faith are honored, just as any other Israelite in this chapter is honored. We have these Gentiles right there with their name in what I'm going to call the Hall of Faith number 2. We talk about Hebrews 11 as the Hall of Faith, and it is. I'm going to call this one the Hall of Faith number 2. And even Gentiles are listed right here and honored for their obedience of faith to go back to the land. What an amazing thing. There's actually one more group, too, that's very, very similar to these Nephilim. It's verse 55 through verse 57. It's a very short little list. And what is this list called in verse 55? It says, the children of Solomon's servants. And then it goes to mention these family names in verse 55 through 57. Well, who is the children of Solomon's servants? Well, if you remember in the days of Solomon, he started making alliances with all kinds of nations around him, right? Moab and Ammon and places in Jordan and Egypt and Tyre and Sidon. And many of the people of those lands became obedient unto faith in God and became believers, became proselytes. And so they became known as these servants of Solomon, Solomon's servants. And so these were former Canaanite and other nations that became believers. I love that. This chapter is not just believing Jews. This chapter is anyone that is a believer. God's initiating work. Do you believe? Yeah, but I'm just a Gentile. I don't care who you are. Do you believe? Yeah, but I'm just a servant. I don't care who you are. Do you believe that this is what God wants to do? All right, then let's go. Let's do it. And all of them, their names are here and recorded. You ever felt like, God calls you and then you're like, yeah, but I'm just or yeah, but I'm not ready, or Moses did that, right? Moses is called, you remember that? And Moses is like, yeah, but I'm not a good speaker. Who made your mouth, Moses? I can deal with this, God says. The next time God initiates a work and you begin by saying, yeah, God, but I'm just but God, I'm not very good at it. Yeah, but God, I don't even know my social security number. Whatever. Yeah, but God, I don't swear. Yeah, but I got this excuse, God. God says, I don't care who you are. Do you believe me that this is what I want to do? If you do, follow me. And your name will be written in the Hall of Fame too. I made that up. You're not going to find that on the internet. Okay? It's not called the Hall of Fame 2 anywhere else. I think it's the Hall of Fame 2. Verse 58, it says, all the Nephilim and the children of Solomon's servants were 392. It even sums up these Gentiles in a verse, almost like to emphasize it. All of these Gentiles that even had faith. There was 392 of them that believed, that turned and came. And now finally, verse 59. These were they which went up from that city, all of these cities, but they could not show their father's house nor their lineage whether they were of Israel. And then it mentions these people in verse 60 through verse 63. So there's families that were living in a certain city, but they couldn't prove that they were of any certain tribe of Israel. Now look what happened to these people that couldn't prove their lineage. It says in verse 62, they sought for their registration among those that were reckoned by their genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore were they as polluted, and they were put out of the priesthood. And this one said to them that they should not eat of the most holy things until there stood up a priest with Urim and Thummim. And you might remember the Urim and the Thummim was the dice that the high priest used in his garment. And it says basically that, look, they couldn't prove if these people were actual Jews or Levites or priests, or if they were even eligible to receive of the sacrifices at the temple. So look, because we don't know for sure, we're going to exclude you. We're just going to consider that you're not able, that you're not eligible for the holy things. And you know why they do this? This is important to recognize why they do that. They had such respect for the law that they would not allow them to engage in the holy things until they knew for sure. That's important because this shows you to what level the Jews protected their genealogies. Now, they no longer do that, but they did it up until the Messiah came. And that's the entire reason why Jewish culture has always tracked genealogies, so that they would ultimately one day, when somebody stood up and said, I'm the Messiah, they would be able to prove his lineage, to say, yes, he is of the tribe of David. Yes, he is of the tribe of David, but not through David's cursed son, Jeconiah. And so they treated this so seriously that they would not allow these Israelites to be included until they found out. And now we got to keep going, verse 64 through verse 67, it basically tells us that 10% of all of the people that returned were Levites, were of the tribe of Levi, about 10%. So finally here in verse 68, I'll just read this to conclude this, verse 68. Some of the chief of the fathers, when they came to the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem, they offered freely for the house of God to set it up in its place. They gave after their ability unto the treasure of the work 61,000 drams of gold. Of course, a dram is that bigger, I don't know. It's a dram of gold, and 5,000 pounds of silver, and 100 priests' garments. So the priests and the Levites and some of the people and the singers and the porters and the Nephilim, who are they? Some of the Gentiles, dwelt in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. So these leaders, the offering here that we see by these leaders would have set the tone for how they would have all acted back in the land. They're not just faithful men to go and uproot their lives. They're already giving of everything they have to establish the work of the Lord. And I want to just close chapter 2 by reminding you, why is all of these names here? Did you ever do that when you were little? You're like, 18 verses into reading a list of names and you're like, oh, what verse am I on again? And your head hurts. And you're like, why am I reading this, right? Don't take this out of context, but I'm going to say this, okay? In the context of what we've been doing, don't read those verses. Somebody's going to snip that 10-second video and they're going to blast it all over the internet now. Don't read those verses because it's not about reading the verse. It's about knowing why it's there. And these names are here for two reasons. It's a historical record to continue to track every family until Messiah comes and how serious they took that. That's important. And it's here as a permanent record of reward for the faithful that were prompted into action, moved by the Spirit of God because they took that first step and God filled them with His Spirit and they went into action. And they did, and they gave, and they uprooted, and they worked, and they sweat, and they explained it to their kids that didn't get it. And they might have said goodbye to somebody that didn't want to go, but they did because they wanted to be faithful to the call of God to do what God was calling them to do. And they did it. You want to be restored and let God bring you back to a place of spiritual success. It takes a response to God's call. The Lord is consistently and constantly seeking to restore us to a place at His side, in His will, with His joy and peace. How does He do it? It begins not with us, but it begins with Him initiating a work. See, we are completely depraved. We do not have the ability to say, I know what will please God. Let me try this. It doesn't work that way. There's nothing we can come up with that God would be like, oh, thank you for coming up with that idea. I would love it if you did that. It never works that way. God's Spirit works in a believer and through His Word to initiate a work, and then you have to respond to it. God opens the doors, and then the faithful will respond to the call. It doesn't make for an easy life to respond in faith, but it's what faith is. The faithful know what it means to follow God, even if it's hard, because they believe God, that He's got something good, and that it is worth it, even when we can't see it. And what's such a blessing out of this whole thing is that then God goes and does something like writes your name down in the permanent, eternal record. Man, God honors the faithful remnant. And I say the faithful remnant. You know why I say that? Do you know how many Jews went right here? 40,000. 40,000. How many Jews do you think there were at this time living in captivity and all over the place? Millions. Millions. How many said, I'll go. I'll be faithful to what God's calling. I'll do it. 40,000 went in this first wave of 3 waves. That's it. Do you feel like sometimes like, why am I the only one obeying God? Well, there's only 40,000 that went out of millions of Jews that were around. Faithful know what it means to give up the temporary, but they gain the eternal. What grace God bestowed on them to list them here, and what grace God's willing to bestow on us. So how should we respond to God's gracing us? With a fresh start, with new chances to serve and to love Him? How do we need to respond today? This is what it means to have a fresh start. This is the motivation that we should be living by, to live for God daily. He not only gives us meaningful work to do, but then He says, oh, you responded to me? Oh, I'm going to reward you even more. I'm going to bless you in some way with even more love and even more grace. What an amazing thing. Isn't God so good? Amen.
Pastor Dan's been teaching through the book of Ezra here on Believing the Word. Thanks for being part of our listening audience. Are you loving the book of Ezra as we're working our way through this Old Testament book? Or is it bringing up more questions in your head? We'd love to have a better idea of how these messages are impacting you and what you're learning from God's Word. Would you let us know? There are a few ways to get in touch with us. First of all, you can give us a call at 717-500-1102. Share what you're learning and even share a prayer request you might have. Once again, the phone number to call us is 717-500-1102. You can also join the conversation on Facebook as we deliver encouraging content to your newsfeed. In addition, our website has a contact tab and a prayer request tab. Go ahead and go there. cchambersburg.org and get in touch with us. Having a personal touch point with our listeners really blesses us and helps us understand the far-reaching effects the Bible and its truths are having on our listeners. If you're in the Chambersburg, Pennsylvania area, we'd be so happy for you to come visit us this Sunday. We have small groups that start at 9 a.m. Our main service starts at 10:30 a.m. We also have a midweek service on Thursday evenings at 6:30 p.m. Please join us for a time of encouragement. Come back for more on Believing the Word with Pastor Dan Shunk.